The sun had barely crept above the horizon, casting long shadows across the streets of Ibadan, as Ifeanyi's hands clenched around the cold metal of the bus stop rail. His eyes, though tired, held an edge, an intensity that had come with years of living in the shadows of a lie too heavy to carry. The world around him was both unfamiliar and oddly comforting. The rush of early morning traffic and the chatter of street vendors selling their wares felt different from the suffocating luxury of Lagos. Here, there was no pretense. People had no choice but to hustle, to fight for every meal, for every opportunity. It was a place where hard work was not optional, but survival. Ifeanyi was no longer the naive son of a billionaire. He had grown into a man who knew the weight of sacrifice, the meaning of true struggle. A man who had tasted life's darkest corners, far away from the gold-encrusted walls of his father's mansion. It had been a long time since he had heard the name that was once his legacy, Ifeanyi Nwosu. His father's empire, the sprawling Nwosu conglomerate, was now a world away, a distant past that felt more like a dream than reality. It had all started when they told him that he was dead. It was a lie. The night his life was stolen from him had been a blur of confusion. A whispered phone call in the dead of night and the sudden crash of his entire world. The headlines in every newspaper screamed the same tragic words: Ifeanyi Nwosu Jr. perishes in car crash. The very son of the billionaire oil mogul was dead. There was no room for questions, no time for grieving. The funeral was arranged with all the lavishness and ceremony one could expect from one of the richest men in Nigeria. But it was all a performance, one that had fooled the world, and most painfully, himself. His father had orchestrated it all, convincing the world that his son was gone. Envy had poisoned his father's business world. A world where power was measured by shares, where loyalty was fleeting, and where rivals were not just competitors, they were enemies waiting for the smallest crack in your armor. Ifeanyi's father, Chief Ifeanyi Nwosu, was the largest shareholder in his company, and with that power came the bitter taste of envy from those who longed to see him fall. The other billionaires and corporate sharks surrounding his father were threatened by his success, and they saw his son as the greatest threat to their ambitions. They wanted him out of the picture. Permanently. Fearing for the life of his son, Ifeanyi Nwosu had made a brutal decision. He couldn't protect his son in the way a father should, so he took matters into his own hands. It was the only way. The world had to believe that Ifeanyi was dead, that he had been tragically taken away in a terrible accident. With that illusion, his enemies would be satisfied. And Ifeanyi's life would be saved. But there was a price to pay. His father had taken his son's identity and buried it with the lie. Ifeanyi had been smuggled out of Lagos in the dead of night, whisked away to Ibadan, a city far from the familiar glitter of Lagos and the suffocating presence of his father's empire. He had been placed in the care of a humble family who knew nothing of his true identity. A family struggling to survive, a family that barely had enough to eat. His new parents had treated him as their own, a blessing from the heavens, but they knew nothing of the truth. To them, Ifeanyi was simply a quiet, mysterious boy who had appeared on their doorstep, with nothing but a suitcase and a strange look in his eyes, a look that spoke of loss, fear, and deep, painful secrets. As the years passed, Ifeanyi adopted a new identity. He became Ife to the world. The boy who had died on that rainy night in Lagos was no more. The world believed his father's lie, but Ifeanyi had not forgotten. Not for a second. He had spent years away from everything he had once known, away from the privilege, away from the life of luxury. But that didn't mean he had forgotten his past. His mind had sharpened, his understanding of the world grew more complex. He had graduated from a local secondary school, his hunger for knowledge and his thirst for something more burning deep inside him. His quiet, almost unnoticed presence among the poorer families of Ibadan allowed him to observe the world from a unique vantage point. He learned to read people, to study their motivations, and above all, to understand the intricacies of power, how it was taken, held, and lost. The university in Ibadan had been his refuge. The University of Ibadan, the oldest in Nigeria, had opened his mind to ideas and ideals that his former life could never have offered. He majored in economics, the very field that would give him the tools to understand the business world that had once been his inheritance. His professors spoke of market forces, supply and demand, the importance of capital. But to Ifeanyi, it wasn't just theory, it was life. He was preparing for a future that was waiting for him, even though it seemed like a distant, impossible dream. In his final year, Ifeanyi had begun to feel something stir inside him. The time had come to return to Lagos. His father had buried him once, but he would not let his legacy die in the grave. He would rise again. But the question that haunted him as he stood at that bus stop was the same one that had haunted him since the moment he had first learned the truth. Was his father's decision to fake his death a betrayal or an act of love? Was it an attempt to protect him from the very world that had killed his mother and nearly killed him, or had it been a desperate attempt to keep power for himself at any cost? Could he ever trust a man who had stolen his identity, a man who had played with his life as though it were a mere pawn in a larger game? And then, there was the darker truth. Were the people his father had once called friends truly the enemies they seemed to be? Or had they been right all along? With a deep breath, Ifeanyi walked forward, away from the shadows of Ibadan, toward the city of Lagos, the city where everything had been stolen from him, the city that would now be the stage for his return. The world around Ifeanyi was small, too small, perhaps, for a boy who had once lived a life of unimaginable wealth. Ibadan was different. It wasn't the polished streets of Lagos, where the world's elites danced around one another in perfect harmony. It wasn't the grand, sprawling mansions of Victoria Island, where wealth was flaunted like a badge of honor. In Ibadan, Ifeanyi learned that life was raw, unrefined, and survival depended on your ability to endure. He had been adopted by a couple, Olu and Damilola Adebayo, who lived in a small, crumbling house on the outskirts of the city. Their home was tucked between narrow alleys, where the scent of fried yam and the sound of children playing in the streets mingled in the air. They were poor, but rich in love, a contrast Ifeanyi had never expected. At first, he hadn't known what to make of them. They were kind but distant, unaware of his true identity. The Adebayo family had struggled their whole lives. Olu worked as a carpenter, fixing doors, windows, and furniture in the neighborhoods, while Damilola was a seamstress, stitching together clothes for the local market. They were good, honest people. But they were trapped in a world of poverty, where every naira counted and there was little hope for upward mobility. Ifeanyi's arrival in their lives had been as sudden as it had been mysterious. One day, Mrs. Damilola had found him on the doorstep of their humble home, a suitcase clutched tightly in his small, trembling hands. His eyes were filled with a mixture of confusion and fear. He had no memory of how he got there, and no one had come looking for him. The Adebayo family had taken him in without question, a stray child in need of refuge. At first, Ifeanyi had kept to himself. He was a quiet boy, withdrawn and distant. He didn't speak much, and when he did, his words carried a heavy weight. The Adebayo's family knew nothing about his past. They had assumed he was simply a child in need of a new life. What they didn't know was that Ifeanyi's soul had been broken, shattered by the loss of everything he had once known. His memories of the mansion, the luxury, the servants, and the power had been drowned out by a tidal wave of grief and confusion. The boy who had been the heir to one of the largest business empires in Nigeria was now an orphan with no past, no name, and no future. But over time, things began to change. Mrs. Damilola was the first to notice his quiet brilliance. He would often sit in the corner of the room, reading whatever scraps of paper he could find, old newspapers, books, even the back of discarded receipts. It was evident that Ifeanyi had an insatiable thirst for knowledge. The Adebayo family had very little in the way of material wealth, but they shared what they had. And what they had most was love and encouragement. They made sure Ifeanyi had food, shelter, and a safe place to grow. Anytime Damilola tried to ask him about his family or sending him to the police, he got very Frightened because his father told him if he tell anybody who he is they will kill him. It was Damilola who first suggested he go to school. You can't just sit here, my son, she had said one afternoon, as Ifeanyi sat reading a dog-eared newspaper from the local market. You have a sharp mind. You could do so much. You have to go to school. At first, Ifeanyi had hesitated. He had never been to a public school before. His life had been filled with private tutors, expensive international schools, and elite social circles. The thought of sitting in a classroom with children from poor families made him feel uncomfortable, ashamed even. But something inside him stirred. He was tired of hiding. Tired of being a ghost. He enrolled in the local secondary school, a small, unkempt building tucked between the market and the slums. The children there were rough around the edges, their clothes ragged, their minds distracted by the struggles of their daily lives. But Ifeanyi, now known as Ife, was different. His appearance was well kept, his manners still formal, sometimes to the point of making others uncomfortable. He had been trained to act like a gentleman, to speak with grace and sophistication. But none of that mattered here. The children could see the difference between him and them. They could see the quiet arrogance in his eyes, the careful way he carried himself. But what they didn't know was the pain behind it all. What they didn't know was that the boy sitting in front of them had once been the son of a billionaire and was now, in a sense, a ghost. He didn't belong to this world. Not really. The first few years were the hardest. Ife struggled to fit in. He couldn't relate to the other children's stories of hunger and hardship. He couldn't relate to their dreams of escape, because he had once lived in a world where such dreams were already a reality. There was no one who truly understood him. Not the way a child from his old world would have. He longed for someone to tell him that he wasn't alone, that he was still important, that he had a place in the world. And then, there was the ever-present worry, what would happen if the world found out who he truly was? What if someone recognized him? What if someone told his father? What would become of him then? His father, Ifeanyi Nwosu, had kept his son's existence a secret from the world. His father had quietly funded his education. His father always visited Ibadan in secret to keep an eye on the Adebayo's family and his son. For years, Ife had no idea how it happened, but his school fees were always paid, without fail. The Adebayo family never saw the money, but the school principal did. Every term, there would be a mysterious deposit into the school's account with a POS name. At first, Ife had been too afraid to ask questions. It didn't make sense. Why would his father, who had pretended he was dead, suddenly care enough to support his education? Was it guilt? Was it love? Or was it something else entirely? Despite the mystery, Ife had focused on his studies. The Adebayo's family knows someone has an eye on Ifeanyi and he means well how consistency he pays his school fees. The quiet payments from his father had allowed him to attend the University of Ibadan, one of the most prestigious universities in Nigeria. It had been a place where Ife could escape the shadows of his past and build a future for himself, one that no longer depended on the wealth of his father, but on his own abilities. It was here, at the University of Ibadan, where Ife finally felt like he could breathe. He had found a space for himself, away from the lies, away from the ghost of the man who had created him, yet abandoned him. He had come to understand economics, the very field that had shaped his father's empire. The theory of supply and demand, the role of capital in shaping society, the cycles of wealth and poverty, these were concepts Ife understood now, concepts he could wield like a weapon. But even as Ife built his own future, there was a gnawing feeling inside him, an insistent question he could never shake: why did his father hide him? And worse still, why had he never reached out to him directly? As Ife stood on the precipice of his final year in Ibadan, the day came when he could no longer hide from the truth. It was time to return. The world needed to know that he was still alive. And he would find the answers to the questions that had haunted him for so long. Lagos. It had been years, but it still held the same overwhelming energy. The city was alive in ways that made everything seem either too fast or too slow. The heat of the day pressed against Ifeanyi as he stepped out of the taxi, his heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and dread. For a moment, he just stood there, staring at the tall, looming structure before him, the Nwosu Towers, the symbol of his father's empire, the place that had once been his inheritance. But it was no longer his. The building, though magnificent, felt hollow. And so did Ifeanyi. The last time he had set foot in this place, it was when he was just a boy, when everything had been stolen from him. When his life had been faked, when his death had been announced to the world, and when his future had been buried along with his mother's memory. Now, standing at the entrance, he was not the heir who had been groomed to inherit a billion-dollar empire. He was Ife, a stranger to the world that had once been his birthright. The receptionist at the entrance barely glanced up as Ife walked in. She had no idea who he was, or the story behind his dark eyes. She notified her boss someone is coming. Mr. Nwosu already seen his son from the camera. His steps echoed through the marble floors, each one heavier than the last. His mind raced. Was this truly the moment he had been waiting for? Just a few hours before, he had sat in a quiet, dimly lit room in his father's mansion, the place that once felt like home. But it hadn't been home in years. It had been a prison. "Father?" Ife had asked, his voice low. Nwosu, now an old man with graying hair and wrinkles that spoke of years of stress, had slowly turned toward him. His face was tired, but his eyes still held that same sharpness, the same calculating gaze that had once driven an empire. The silence between them had been thick with years of unspoken words. Ife had sat across from his father, hands clasped tightly in his lap, waiting for the truth to be revealed. "I know you have questions," his father had finally said, his voice hoarse. "You fake my death," Ife had said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. His father didn't deny it. "I did what I had to do," Chijioke replied. "For you, for both of us." Ife had leaned forward, his fists tightening on the armrest. "For both of us? You lied to me. You erased me from the world. My mother." His father's expression faltered, and for the first time in years, Ife saw the deep pain in his eyes. "Your mother, she didn't die in the way the world believes. She was murdered." The words hit Ife like a hammer. His mother. Murdered? All these years, he had been told she died in a car crash, another casualty of a life lived too dangerously. "I don't understand," Ife whispered. His mind raced with the questions that had been gnawing at him for so long. "Why didn't you protect her? Why didn't you protect me?" Chijioke took a deep breath, his gaze dropping to the floor. The room fell silent once more, and for a long moment, only the sound of their breathing filled the space. "I didn't protect her because we didn't know the enemies was that desperate. Your mother was an outspoken, fearless lady. I didn't want to take any chances with you. If I had sent you to abroad it won't have been easy to fake your death. My son, please find in your heart to forgive me," Chijioke said, his voice breaking. "There were enemies in my own company, men who wanted to see me fall. They were after power, and they would stop at nothing to get it. They didn't just want to bring me down, they wanted everything I had, including you. Your mother's death was no accident, Ife. They orchestrated it. They killed her to get to me." Ife's chest tightened. The pain was unbearable. His mother, the woman he had loved and looked up to, had been taken from him by the very people who had once been his father's friends. His father's gaze softened, regret in his eyes. "It was the only way to keep you safe. I had to let them think you were dead. If they believed you were gone, they would leave you alone. And in doing so, I had to destroy you, to protect you. It was a choice between keeping you alive or losing everything." A long silence passed between them as Ife let the weight of his father's words sink in. "I hate you for what you did," Ife said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I understand now. I understand why. You did it to save me." His heart clenched as he said the words, but somehow, some part of him, the part that was still that boy, wanting to love his father, began to forgive him. "I will help you, father," Ife said, after a long pause. "I will help you take back what's yours. But not as your son." He paused, swallowing the knot in his throat. "I will do it as an employee." Chijioke stared at him, clearly surprised. "What do you mean?" "I'll join your company, but I'll start from the ground up. I need to understand everything. How it works, the power dynamics, the people you trust and the people you don't. You'll see me not as your son, but as a worker who has to earn his place." His father's face darkened. "I won't have you humiliated. I need to do this," Ife said firmly. "I need to earn my way back into the world you built. If I'm going to fight for this family, I need to understand the reality." Chijioke's eyes glistened as he nodded, finally understanding the depth of his son's resolve. "Very well. But be careful. The men who want to destroy me, they are still out there." With that, the path ahead of Ife was set. He had made his decision, he would return to the company. But it wouldn't be as the heir. It would be as a lowly worker, an anonymous part of the system, watching and waiting for the right moment to strike. The first day at Nwosu Towers was a shock to the system. Ife was given a desk, not in the corner office like he had once imagined, but in the cubicle of a lower-level assistant. His job was simple: data entry, filing, and organizing the company's contracts. He wasn't given any special treatment. His colleagues barely acknowledged his presence, and the ones who did made sure to look at him with disdain. Most of them were either ambitious young professionals looking for a leg up, or old men who had been in the company for decades and resented the new blood. But there was one person who made a difference: Ifeanyi Nwosu. Titi was one of the receptionists. She wasn't like the others, she was warm, approachable, and had an air of quiet confidence about her that Ife hadn't seen in anyone else. While the others barely looked up from their work, Titi would greet him with a soft smile every morning, offering him small kindnesses that felt out of place in such a cold, competitive environment. It was a relief, honestly. In a sea of cold shoulders, she was an island of warmth. She made Ife feel like he wasn't invisible, like he mattered, even if it was just for a fleeting moment. But the challenges continued. His superior, Tunji Alawale, was an older man, ruthless in his approach. He made Ife's life hell, constantly reminding him that he was nothing but a lowly worker. He would assign him menial tasks, give him unreasonable deadlines, and belittle him in front of his peers. Every day was a battle. His father visited the company to see how his son is. Ife would caught sight of his father in the corridors, his father, who no longer held the power he once did, reduced to nothing but a shadow of his former self. He only owns 5% of the company he built with his sweat and blood. That is how he used his little power to work Ife employment. The weight of their shared history pressed on Ife, a constant reminder of the price of ambition, of betrayal, and of what it meant to be a part of this ruthless world. But Ife's resolve was unwavering. He would rise. Not by being the son of Chijioke Nwosu, but by being something more, something no one could take from him. The fluorescent lights above hummed incessantly, casting harsh shadows across the rows of cubicles. The sterile, cold air of the office seemed to seep into Ifeanyi's bones as he sat at his desk, lost in a sea of paperwork. Day after day, the same monotonous routine dragged on, and every hour spent in this dreary space felt like a year. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken tension. Tunji, his supervisor, had been on his case non-stop, constantly throwing more work his way, criticizing every mistake, real or imagined. It had been a week of near-daily humiliation. Tunji didn't care that he was breaking his employees down. In fact, he seemed to enjoy it. Ife glanced down at the spreadsheet in front of him, not really seeing it. His mind kept drifting back to his father. Chijioke Nwosu, the once powerful mogul who had built an empire, was now a mere shadow of his former self. His shares in the company had dwindled to a pitiful 5%, the result of years of poor decisions, corporate betrayals, and failed alliances. Ife had never imagined his family's legacy could fall so far, so fast. The men his father had trusted had turned their backs on him, sinking their claws into the heart of Nwosu enterprises. And Ife, though technically still part of the family, had nothing to show for it. He was just another faceless worker in this vast machine, a nobody. But deep down, he knew he wasn't going to stay a nobody for long. This was only temporary. His father's empire, his birthright, had been taken from him, but it could be reclaimed. He'd have to be patient, careful, and methodical. This wasn't the world his father had once controlled with an iron fist. This was a new, more dangerous world, filled with backstabbing, manipulation, and enemies lurking at every corner. And yet, even in this sea of indifference and corporate warfare, there was something, someone, that offered him a small spark of humanity. TT, the receptionist. She was a constant source of quiet support, though neither of them ever acknowledged it directly. TT had always treated him with more kindness than anyone else at the office, but that didn't mean she knew who he really was. She didn't know that he was the son of the former owner of Nwosu Enterprises, the heir to the company that had been brought to its knees by treachery. No, TT didn't know any of that. To her, Ife was just another employee. Just another worker slogging through the mundane tasks of corporate life. And that was exactly how he wanted it. For now, his true identity had to remain hidden. It was late afternoon when TT stopped by his desk again. The office was quieter now, most of the other employees having gone home or vanished into meetings. "You okay?" she asked, her voice gentle. Ife looked up from his screen, startled. He hadn't realized how tense he'd become, how deep in thought he'd been. He forced a smile. "I'm fine. Just dealing with some things." She tilted her head slightly, eyes searching his face. There was something unspoken between them, a quiet understanding that he couldn't fully explain. "You've been looking a bit stressed lately." "Just trying to keep up," Ife replied, shrugging. "You know how it is. A lot of work to do, no help." "I noticed," TT said. Her tone was warm but laced with a hint of sympathy. "But don't let them wear you down. They'll push you until you break, but you don't have to take it. I've seen them do it to so many people here." "Yeah," Ife muttered, "I'm getting the sense they're trying to push me out." "Don't let them," she said with surprising fierceness. "It's not right, what they're doing to you. Don't let Mrs. Tunji, or anyone else, think they can walk all over you. You've got more in you than they know." Ife felt a pang of gratitude, though he didn't show it. TT's words were a brief flicker of light in an otherwise oppressive environment. But he couldn't allow himself to get too attached to anyone here, especially not her. He cleared his throat, trying to keep his focus on the work in front of him. "I'll manage. It's just one of those days, you know." TT hesitated for a moment, as if weighing her next words. "Listen, Ife," she said quietly, "I've been here for a long time. I've seen people come and go, and I can tell you, things here aren't as they seem." Ife raised an eyebrow but didn't respond immediately. He had learned to be careful, to trust very few people in this corporate jungle. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice guarded. "People like Tunji and Ola. They're not what they seem," she said, her voice lowering even further. "Your boss. Tunji not just a hard ass. He's got his own agenda, and he's using people to get ahead. It's not just the usual office politics. They've been at this for years." Ife's pulse quickened, though he didn't let his face betray him. His eyes, however, hardened slightly. "Tunji? Ngozi?" TT nodded slowly, her eyes flicking around the office, as if checking to make sure no one was listening. "You wouldn't believe the things I've seen. It's all about power, Ife. These people are playing a game, and the rest of us are just pawns in it. I don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but there's more at play than just bad management. Ife's mind began to race, his fingers tightening on the edge of his desk. He hadn't expected anyone to speak so plainly about the games being played behind closed doors. It was true. He had known that Tunji, Ngozi, Ola were dangerous, but hearing it from someone like TT made it feel real. I'm just trying to get through the day, Ife said, though the words felt hollow. But I'll be careful. TT gave him a small smile, the kind that felt like both encouragement and warning. You've got a good head on your shoulders, Ife. Just don't let them crush you. She lingered a moment longer before walking away, her presence slipping out of his cubicle as quietly as she had entered. Ife stared after her, thoughts swirling. TT didn't know who he was. To her, he was just another employee, one of many anonymous faces in the corporate labyrinth. But for Ife, she had become a lifeline in a place that seemed bent on erasing him. And her warning echoed in his mind, don't let them crush you. That night, Ife sat in the dim light of his apartment, staring at the city below. Lagos seemed so far removed from the quiet life he'd lived in Ibadan, but the challenges here were even more complex. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore, he was fighting for his father's legacy. And that legacy had been stolen, piece by piece, by people like Tunji, Ngozi and co. He had to figure out a way to fight back, but how? He couldn't do it alone. And for now, no one could know the truth of who he really was. The clock ticked on, and Ife knew that the fight had just begun.